At first, the story sounded almost routine. Drone strikes, national security, Venezuelan trafficking networks, tough language from the White House. Another late-night escalation packaged for television like a movie trailer where America is always one missile away from restoring order. After years of chaos, outrage, impeachment talk, classified leaks, and constitutional brinkmanship, most people probably glanced at the headlines and kept scrolling. Nothing feels shocking anymore when the political system has trained the country to live inside permanent emergency mode. Then people started asking one very simple question: who authorized this? And the answer now detonating across Washington may be more disturbing than the strikes themselves, because according to congressional leaders, Donald Trump allegedly approved at least 14 coordinated drone strikes in the Caribbean basin, targeting Venezuelan narcotics operations without properly notifying Congress beforehand. No emergency bipartisan briefing, no meaningful consultation, no visible attempt to involve the legislative branch before military force crossed sovereign borders. Members of Congress reportedly learned about active American military operations the same way ordinary citizens did, through breaking news alerts, social media posts, and cable television coverage already racing ahead of the constitutional process itself. And suddenly this stopped looking like another noisy political controversy. This started looking like a president testing whether the guardrails still exist. Because here's the part that should make every American uncomfortable regardless of party affiliation. The Constitution was intentionally designed to slow war down. The Founding Fathers did not trust concentrated military power. They had just escaped a monarchy where one man could drag an entire nation into bloodshed based on personal impulse, wounded pride, or political desperation. So they split the authority deliberately. Congress holds the power to declare war. The president commands the military only within limits defined by law. Messy? Absolutely. Frustrating? Constantly. But the system was built to force deliberation before destruction. Donald Trump appears to have looked at that system and decided it was optional. And now Washington is in meltdown mode. Congressional Democrats are openly discussing impeachment again. Others are demanding the House reconvene immediately to move a war powers resolution. Some lawmakers are even invoking conversations about the 25th Amendment, arguing the president's actions demonstrate dangerous recklessness at the exact moment the federal government is already collapsing under a brutal shutdown crisis. But the most revealing detail is not what Trump said. It's what he didn't say. Trump defended the strikes using the familiar language of executive authority, strength, national security, and anti-cartel enforcement. What he did not explain was why Congress was allegedly bypassed if there was enough time to coordinate a multi-stage military operation. He did not explain why lawmakers were finding out through media leaks instead of classified channels. He did not explain what imminent threat justified sidestepping the constitutional framework established under the War Powers Resolution of 1973. And that silence matters, because when presidents stop explaining why limits apply to them, power stops behaving like public service and starts behaving like ownership. The terrifying thing about unchecked executive authority is that it never leaves office quietly. Every power a president seizes becomes a weapon waiting for the next administration. That is how republics slowly drift toward something colder, harder, and far more dangerous than democracy. And this is where the entire MAGA defense framework begins collapsing under its own contradictions. Because the White House and Trump allies immediately pivoted to the same argument Americans have heard for decades whenever executive power expands. The president is the commander-in-chief. He must act quickly. Threats move faster than Congress. National security cannot survive endless debate. On the surface, that sounds persuasive. In a real emergency, presidents absolutely possess broad latitude to respond before lawmakers can gather in a chamber and hold procedural votes. The problem is that this case does not resemble a sudden missile launch racing toward Miami. It does not resemble Pearl Harbor. It does not resemble an imminent invasion. According to the timeline emerging from reports inside Washington, this operation appears to have involved planning, coordination, assessment pauses, and escalating stages of military action. Sources described a structured campaign, not a split-second defensive reflex. Trump himself reportedly weighed military action for days beforehand while publicly discussing frustration over negotiations and security concerns. That detail changes everything. Because once an operation becomes deliberate instead of reactive, constitutional obligations begin reappearing like ghosts the administration can no longer explain away. The War Powers Resolution of 1973 is not vague about this. Congress built that law specifically because presidents from both parties kept stretching military authority further and further beyond democratic oversight after Vietnam. The law outlines 3 narrow doors through which a president can introduce armed forces into hostilities: a declaration of war, explicit statutory authorization, or a national emergency created by an attack on the United States or its armed forces. Critics now argue the Caribbean drone campaign fits none of them. And here comes the most politically toxic question of all. If there was enough time to coordinate the strikes, why was there supposedly not enough time to notify Congress? That question is now hanging over Capitol Hill like smoke after an explosion because it attacks the administration's credibility directly. This is no longer about whether Venezuelan trafficking networks are dangerous. Most Americans already assume cartels are dangerous. This is about process, authority, restraint. The part of democracy designed to stop one individual from unilaterally deciding when military force becomes acceptable policy. Imagine a police officer claiming he skipped obtaining a warrant because he was too busy preparing the raid. That explanation would collapse instantly in court because preparation itself proves there was time for procedure. The more organized this military campaign appears, the weaker the emergency justification becomes. And members of Congress know it. That is why the reaction in Washington escalated from outrage to genuine institutional panic within hours. Lawmakers were not merely offended, they were humiliated, constitutionally sidelined, reduced to spectators watching military operations unfold on television while the executive branch treated consultation like optional paperwork. Even more dangerous for Trump politically, the backlash is no longer confined to progressive Democrats. Quiet concern is spreading among constitutional conservatives, defense hawks, and legal originalists who suddenly find themselves trapped between loyalty to Donald Trump and loyalty to the structure of government they spent decades claiming to defend. Because if a Republican president can bypass Congress for offensive military operations today, then a future Democratic president inherits the same expanded authority tomorrow. And that is the irony poisoning the entire Republican coalition right now. The movement that once warned endlessly about unchecked federal power is now being forced to defend one of the most aggressive expansions of unilateral executive military authority in modern political memory. And the deeper this story goes, the uglier the political timing becomes. Because Donald Trump did not launch these strikes during a period of national stability or institutional calm. He did it while Washington was already choking on a brutal government shutdown that had stretched for weeks, freezing federal operations, suspending paychecks, and exhausting public patience. Entire agencies were limping through paralysis while Congress and the White House were locked in a fiscal knife fight. Then suddenly, almost like a scene change in a political thriller, the national conversation shifted from shutdown chaos to missiles, drone footage, and presidential wartime authority. And critics immediately started asking the question the administration desperately does not want attached to this timeline. Was this really about security, or was it about spectacle? Because history is filled with leaders who discovered that foreign conflict can temporarily silence domestic weakness. A collapsing news cycle suddenly reorganizes itself around patriotism, fear, urgency, and executive strength. Cameras stop focusing on dysfunction and start focusing on command. The president stops looking trapped and starts looking powerful. That temptation has existed for centuries. The problem is that when military force becomes politically useful, democracy enters extremely dangerous territory. Now add another explosive ingredient to the fire. In the middle of this crisis, Trump reportedly pressured Republicans to eliminate the Senate filibuster in order to break the shutdown deadlock, effectively demanding that his own party destroy one of the last procedural barriers limiting majority power in the upper chamber. Think about the pattern forming here. Congress allegedly bypassed on military action, institutional procedure framed as inconvenience, debate treated like obstruction, checks and balances portrayed as weakness. The Senate pressured to abandon the mechanism specifically designed to slow power down. Individually, each controversy can be defended, spun, rationalized. Together, they begin forming something much darker, a governing philosophy where limits themselves become the enemy. And the polling data emerging from this moment should terrify both parties. According to late October numbers referenced in the fallout, 57% of Americans reportedly believe Trump's recent actions are eroding trust in government itself. Not trust in Democrats, not trust in Republicans, trust in the machinery of the American system as a whole. That distinction matters enormously. Because republics rarely collapse overnight, most democracies decay slowly through accumulated disbelief. Citizens stop trusting elections, stop trusting courts, stop trusting Congress, stop trusting the idea that rules apply equally. Eventually, people no longer see institutions as legitimate restraints on power, only obstacles powerful people maneuver around until they get what they want anyway. And once that psychological shift happens, authoritarianism no longer arrives wearing combat boots. It arrives promising efficiency. That is what makes this moment so morally dangerous. Millions of ordinary Americans live under rules that are enforced instantly. Miss a tax filing deadline and penalties arrive. Violate workplace procedure and careers disappear. Ignore court orders and consequences come fast. But when the most powerful office on earth allegedly bypasses constitutional process surrounding military force, the country suddenly gets lectures about flexibility, executive necessity, and political interpretation. That moral contrast is radioactive. Because somewhere tonight there are American families struggling through shutdown uncertainty, federal workers wondering how to pay rent, military personnel following lawful chains of command overseas, while the political class in Washington debates whether the president himself is still operating inside the constitutional chain of command at all. And once a nation begins seriously asking that question about its own commander-in-chief, the crisis is no longer partisan theater. The crisis becomes existential, and this is the point where the story stops being about Donald Trump entirely and starts becoming a stress test for the American system itself. Because impeachment headlines come and go, political outrage burns hot and disappears. Cable news turns constitutional conflict into entertainment so often that audiences become emotionally numb. But underneath all the noise, something far more permanent may be happening right now. The definition of presidential power is being rewritten in real time through repetition, exhaustion, and public desensitization. That is how democratic erosion actually works. Not through one dramatic moment where tanks roll through Washington and the Constitution bursts into flames on live television. It happens gradually. One exception becomes precedent. One emergency becomes justification. One bypassed procedure becomes the new baseline, until eventually the public forgets where the original line even was. And the most dangerous part is that Trump is not operating in a vacuum. Every future president is watching this unfold. Every ambitious administration is studying the reaction. They are learning how much outrage the public can absorb before fatigue replaces resistance. They are learning whether Congress still possesses the political will to defend its own constitutional authority when confronted by a White House willing to move first and explain later. That is why the legal battle forming around these strikes matters so much. Lawsuits, injunctions, congressional investigations, constitutional challenges, they may move painfully slowly, but they create the historical record future governments inherit. Supreme Court interpretations born from moments like this can shape executive power for generations. The terrifying irony is that by the time courts fully untangle whether this operation violated the War Powers Resolution, the political culture itself may already have adapted to the behavior. And once public adaptation happens, accountability becomes infinitely harder. Because outrage has a shelf life, chaos has become normalized in modern America. The public gets flooded with so many simultaneous crises that attention itself starts collapsing. Shutdown fights, filibuster threats, military escalation, impeachment discussions, midnight social media posts, constitutional arguments, polling panic. The sheer volume overwhelms people until survival instinct takes over and they emotionally disengage. That disengagement is politically priceless for anyone seeking expanded power because exhausted citizens stop demanding structural accountability. They start craving stability instead. Even if stability comes wrapped in unchecked authority. That is the authoritarian temptation hidden underneath this entire episode. The seductive argument that democratic procedure is too slow, too inefficient, too chaotic for modern threats. That Congress talks too much. That debate creates weakness. That one strong executive figure acting decisively is preferable to institutional friction. But the American system was intentionally designed to create friction. The founders wanted ambition to collide against ambition. They wanted government branches fighting each other because they understood something ancient and brutally true about human nature. Power does not regulate itself voluntarily. No president wakes up one morning and decides to surrender authority simply because restraint feels morally elegant. limits survive only when institutions enforce them aggressively. And that brings us to the real question hanging over this crisis tonight. If Congress learns about military action through news alerts instead of constitutional process, what exactly remains of congressional war authority? If presidents can invoke national security whenever procedure becomes inconvenient, where does executive power stop expanding? And if laws only function when powerful people choose to respect them, are they really laws anymore? Because this is no longer just another Trump controversy. This is a referendum on whether the American system still possesses the strength to restrain the people running it. If you believe these constitutional battles matter, make sure to like this video, comment with your perspective, share this breakdown with someone following the crisis, and subscribe for more deep political analysis and investigative coverage.